We're going to make a start here. As you will notice, when I talk to you, I have a beautiful microphone. This microphone is for the purposes of recording what I'm saying, but it doesn't actually giving you anything more than my voice. So I should just check, do you hear me at the back of the room? We thought the room is small and we don't think we need projection. Okay, my name is Tim Anstey. I'm the... What's... Say what you're going to say. Yeah. How do I do that? Is that better? I've refreshed the page. I'm Director of Research here, and I'm kind of welcoming you as the host from the institution. In a couple of minutes, I'm going to hand over to Fredrik Nilsson, who is Director of Architecture in the Making, the Strong Research Environment in Architecture Theory and Method, who will say some words about the environment. But I thought just before that, just very quickly to say welcome to the days. The idea of what we're doing now is that we're having this evening and then 2 following days looking at projects that have been research projects that are being produced in an environment about theory and method in architecture, which is a collaborative initiative between the Swedish architecture schools. And the form for that we've chosen is to run a series of, everything is open, but a series of keynote lectures with people we think are interesting, have something interesting to say to the subject we want to talk about in these days. And between those, a series of quite intimate project presentations. So what you'll find going on in the next 2 days is in A3 and A4 continuous presentations of work that's being done. I think that format can be very nice. Just so you know, as a couple of housekeeping points, there is a printed program that you're very welcome to take. There's a pile of these at the back of the room that tell you the different things that are going on in the days. You can also go to this website here at any stage, and after Fredrik's talked, I will click on this box here, which will bring up that program on the website, which is live. And on that program is also a Wi-Fi address, so you can get up online while you're in the room. So that's more or less all the housekeeping that needs to be done. Fredrik, would you just like to say a little bit about the environment? And then I will talk a bit about this evening. Okay. My name is Fredrik Nilsson. I'm Professor of Architectural Theory at Chalmers School of Architecture in Gothenburg. As Tim said, I'm Director for this strong research environment called Architecture in the Making. And it's almost exactly 2 years ago, on the 14th of April 2011, that it was announced by the Swedish Research Council Formus that 3 large applications were granted funding for 2 strong research environments and a national research school. And all these 3 applications were handed in collaboration with the 4 schools of architecture in Sweden, here at KTH, Chalmers in Gothenburg, LTH in Lund, and UMA in Umeå. And that was, in a way, the end of a 2-year effort to actually enable this initiative on architectural research, with a background of an evaluation made by Formas in 2006. And on the panel, actually, Adrian was evaluating the Swedish architectural research, and they pointed out some weaknesses. There were fragmented environments, there was a lack of funding for architectural research, and there was a lack of theoretical awareness and development going on. And they actually made some recommendations to the community of architectural research to start collaborating, to network, to have strategies for young researchers, etc. And in 2009, the 4 schools of architecture came together and start discussing this. And during the 2 years up until these grants were funded, a collaboration between the 4 schools started to develop, and in dialogue with Formas enabled this project. So in 2011, now in the autumn of 2011, about 1.5 years ago, this environment, this work with building these platforms up started. And the 2 research environments that were granted was this architecture in the making, architecture as a making discipline and material practice, and it's hosted at Chalmers, but includes then researchers from all schools of architecture. The second one is hosted here at KTH, called Architecture in Effect, Rethinking the Social in Architecture. And as a platform for all this, the National Research School called RESARC, hosted in Lund, started to be built up as well. And the 2 strong research environments have slightly different perspectives on architectural research. From our point of view, we take the perspective from practice to develop a research environment, a long-term innovative platform for research from the perspective of practice, to develop theories and methods from this perspective, to strengthen architectural research, to make it more competitive in relation to other disciplines. And the other strong research environment has a more of a critical, theoretical or social political perspective. So in a way we complement each other on developing theory and methods in architecture. So during these 1.5 years, a lot of activities has been going on. There have been several symposia and seminars, and a lot of research projects been started. And these days here, this event is then a review days presenting some ongoing projects, some planned projects, and also some finished projects. So I'm welcoming you all to participate in these discussions that we hope will also continue then in the constructive ways that has been so far in the collaboration with all the 4 schools to develop this debates, these discussions, and a more of a conscious theoretical development on architectural research. And as Tim said, there are some between these presentations also some keynote lectures with prominent international guests invited, and one of them will Tim say something more about now.
Yeah, I'll just say a bit about. Very quickly, let's hope this works. If I click here on this website, I get the program, okay? I get it as a PDF document. See if it comes up as a PDF document on this way. Great. Okay, so then we started talking about projects. Rather intensively in architecture discussion. It's kind of one of those kind of keywords that recurs and recurs and recurs until you almost don't think about it anymore. There's always a project if you're an architect. But we thought that in terms of the role that this environment has, it's worth taking a couple of minutes just to wonder, well, what do we mean by a project in architecture? And what is it now? And is it now the same thing as it was from the beginning? And if there was a beginning, when was that? And what is this word about? Where does it come from? What's its history? What baggage does it carry with it? And so that kind of became a sort of platform to think about a series of presentations which could be getting input from interesting people to talk on the theme, and also then a series of discussions which we hope to have after these keynote lectures. So each keynote lecture will be a set-piece keynote lecture by someone we think is interesting, followed by people from the environment with that person discussing around a theme, a sub-theme of this question about the project. I could scan through this a little bit. Thinking about someone who would be very interesting to talk about this, I put my hand up for Professor Adrian Forty, who's Professor in History at the Bartlett School of Architecture as part of University College London, and who's here with us tonight, and we're very happy about that. Adrian flew in last night and has just done an opposition on a doctoral thesis, which is the thesis about the use of steel and what steel means as a material. And the reason I think I was very keen to have Adrian here really is based on two key books he's produced, which have become, one of them a kind of classic, and the other one I think will become a classic. It's newly produced. So the first of the books is his study, Words and Buildings, where he started to look very carefully at the vocabulary that particularly modernist architecture has used, and the words, a bit like project, that have become so everyday that you no longer think about them, and really recovering their history and becoming very accurate and precise about making us understand that we're working with a kind of constructed discourse in architecture. That book I thought was a fabulous, or a very elegant way of showing us to what extent the way in which we frame the discourse affects the things that happen materially. Moving on from that, in 2012, Adrian finished the book Concrete and Culture, which for me almost, you could say, goes the other way. That suddenly the thing at issue was a particular material, and the book unfolds the way in this material has had cultural values in different ways over the 20th century. And that, in some way, in terms of the discussion tonight, the relationship between the very material and the very written is something I think is of great interest. So I would like to give the word to Adrian. And I'll just leave you with your I'll leave you with your computer. You can turn this website off. I can kill that. Great. I'll just get rid of that. And
okay.
You have.
I'm wired up. I don't need that. You better take it away because it'll cause trouble.
Your turn,
okay. You can, yes, don't make it too dim. I have to turn the lights up.
I think it's the same as our bathroom.
Like that?
Can you see the screen?
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you very much, Tim and Frederick. It's very nice to be here, having seen the preparation of this research environment. It's very nice actually to see it happening now, so I'm enjoying being here. So, for this evening's discussion, what is a project? This is the theme that we've been asked to think about tonight and over the next 2 days. What is a project? When I wrote the book, which Tim mentioned, Words and Buildings, I looked at a number of key words in architectural discourse, and project was not one of them. And I don't quite know why I never even considered including it. Maybe because it's one of those things that are so obvious that you don't even think about it. And there were a number of other words that I considered talking about, writing about in the book, and didn't write about, but project wasn't even one of those. It wasn't even on my reject list. So when this invitation came up, I was a little wondering what to do. And I was thinking, well, if I had included the word project, how might I have talked about it? How might I have written about this project, the project? How could I have approached it? And it seemed to me that the way I might have thought about it is really as follows, that there seemed to me to be really two senses in which this word exists in architectural discourse. The first sense comes from, if you like, the original Latin source of the word project, proiecere, which means to throw forward. It's what is thrown forward. It is what is planned for the future. It is about something that has yet to take place. A project is a planned or proposed undertaking, something that will happen in the future. Now, architects are expert in managing these. This is what architects do. They're always thinking about things that haven't happened yet. Most of the architect's life is concerned with what has not yet taken place. The whole practice is concerned with thinking about how to bring into existence things that do not yet exist. So this is the first sense of the project. It is what is thrown forward into the future. And it deals in mental concepts, in ideas. So that is, if you like, is the first feature of the project. However, within the world of architecture, and indeed in other worlds as well, the project has quite a different sense in that it refers to something that has already happened. We also talk about the project as a work that has already been completed and exists. The project is, if you like, also the realization of the plan. And this quite literal, this sense of the project as referring to actual things has a very, there are many examples of this, but the most obvious one is what Americans call projects, which means social housing. A project in American parlance means a collection of existing buildings, social housing. But other practices also talk about projects as things that already exist. So there is this tension, if you like, in project as between what does not yet exist but is planned and what is already completed. And the way in which we use project oscillates between these two. And that seems to me to be might be the thing that could be interesting to think about in this discussion. there are other things about projects which come up. One is that a project is generally seen as something that is a result of a collaboration. That is often taken for granted, that people talk about business projects and whatever, and the assumption is then that there is some degree of collaboration. And often also a result of research. A project is something which is an outcome from or a process of research, and that's the sense which is often described when a student does a project. A student's project is something which is produced through research to realize some kind of result. They are practical things, projects that involve research. So there are these other aspects of it. And then also in architecture, there's another sense which comes up, which is the use really which comes from the reference to geometry, where there is the technique of projecting a solid onto a flat surface. So that's this geometrical sense of turning something that is solid into something that is flat is referred to as projection. Now, architects are experts in this, but they are experts in reverse. They're experts in turning things that are first conceived on flat surfaces into solids. But it's essentially the same process. Now, this aspect of architecture, of the project, what Italians call progettazione, but is usually translated into English as design, conveys something quite specific. It's the way in which things in the real world are translated into the language of architecture and vice versa. It's a particular aspect of the architect's education and formation, is learning how to make this translation between the language of architecture and the phenomenal world, which is also part, as I understand it, of the project or projection. So this is, I mean, this is kind of suggesting these ideas very loosely, but they seem to, when I started thinking about it, they were the things that seemed to be at issue if one's going to talk about the project in relation to architecture. Okay, now what I'm going to do this evening is to, first of all, talk about a project of my own, and then I'm going to talk about a project of another kind, which might help draw out some of the issues that I've been talking about. So the project of my own that I'm going to talk about is in thinking about how a project in my field, which is architectural history, might be developed. Okay. Well, the origin of this project goes back to the time when I was working on words and buildings, and having spent a lot of time thinking about the fugitive, ephemeral world of language, I wanted to work on something where there was substance, where there were things. And this seemed to be quite a good topic to pursue as an alternative to the fugitive world of language. So I started thinking about concrete, and my intention was to approach this as I described it as an entertainment. Now, the English writer Graham Greene used to distinguish between his serious novels and then the novels which were a bit more lightweight, and he called those entertainments. And I saw this work as being an entertainment in that sense, as being not quite so serious as possibly some of the other things that one might do. Now, this was quite useful to me because it's quite liberating. As soon as you've designated something an entertainment, you're not obliged to make sure that you cover every piece of ground and respond to every possible situation or objection or collaborate or whatever. It gives one certain freedoms to leave things out if you want to do it. So this was quite useful to me, this decision of my mind early on, that I knew I was not going to be comprehensive. I could deal with the things that appealed to me but leave out other things. Now, just to say, first of all, obviously I'm not the first person ever to have written a book about concrete. There are lots of others in the world. So what was it that I was going to do that was different? How was I going to approach this differently? Well, there are several things that as I started thinking about it and researching it, I found myself thinking. Well, the first of these is that one of the features of concrete is that it's everywhere. It's a global medium. Wherever you go, there's always a piece of concrete nearby. Pretty much everywhere. And this seemed to me to be interesting, that we have something which is present more or less everywhere in the world. And this immediately presents some challenges, but my starting point was a different one to most of the other people who've written about concrete, who tend to look at concrete in one particular place or in a few specific parts of the world. I didn't want to do this. I wanted to deal with the fact that it occurs everywhere and to deal with its occurrence everywhere as part of its subject, to think about it, in other words, in universal terms. We have this universal material. How is then one to think about it universally? So that was the first question. The second thing that struck me about the other books on concrete that I'd looked at is that they mostly concentrated on its technical properties. The interest in concrete was seen as lying in its various techniques and processes, in the introduction of steel reinforcement, in techniques of pre-stressing, in ways of making shell concrete, the use of substitutes for cement, ground glass, blast furnace slag, and so on, ways of reducing the CO2 content of concrete, of making stronger concretes, and so on. There's an awful lot which is about the technical aspects of concrete. Now, I don't deny that these are interesting, but relatively speaking, the technologies of concrete haven't changed all that much since the beginning. was done now, the concrete elements would be a little more slender, and there'd be some more adventurous things going on. The concrete would be set more quickly than it would have done here, and so on. But relatively speaking, I would say that the technical innovations within concrete construction have been modest. That what we now, this is recognizable. We know this. This is, and it's been around for quite a long time. More interesting to me than the physical properties of concrete are its metaphysical properties. That is to say, the place that it occupies in our minds. 120 years ago, concrete, reinforced concrete, wasn't there. Now it's here. We have it. And we have a lot of it. Let me tell you that we produce 3 tons of concrete per year for every person on the planet. So you might like to think for a moment, you know, what happened to your 3 tons of concrete last year? You know, there is a great deal of it around. But it wasn't there 120 years ago. So the question is, how, in a sense, have we fitted this into our heads? How have we accommodated this, the presence of this substance that wasn't there before? We've had to do this with quite a lot of other things, with plastics, mobile phones, all sorts of things. We've adjusted to accommodate the arrival of new technologies, but my question is, how have we adjusted to accommodate this particular technology, which is concrete? And people, when I was working on this, they'd say, where are you starting? Are you starting with the Romans? And I'd say, no, I'm not starting with the Romans. And actually, my starting point 1516, and he describes the houses of the utopians, the people who live in his no place, utopia, and he describes them as follows, as if you read this. All the homes are of handsome appearance with 3 stories. The exposed faces of the walls are made of stone or cement or brick, rubble being used as filling for the empty space between the walls. The roofs are flat and covered with a kind of cement, which is cheap, but so well mixed that it is impervious to fire and superior to lead in defying the damage caused by storms. So what had happened is that Moore had imagined a substance which didn't yet exist, a substance which is, to all effects, what we now know as concrete. So clearly it is something that could be said to exist in imagination before it exists in fact. And it's this presence of the substance in imagination that interests me, and its relation to then what happens in the actual world. So this is really the second of my concerns, is how to reconcile this fact that we have something that exists in imagination with its presence within the world. Now the third concern that I had when I was thinking about this is that, and indeed one of the things that attracted me to the subject at all in the first place, is that a lot of people don't like concrete. It has many negative connotations. Responses to it are frequently negative. Concrete is a substance with a bad name. And how are we to think about this? Now, most of the books written about concrete turn out to be apologies for concrete. They are trying to justify the presence of this substance. They try to persuade us that what people find ugly is really beautiful. I did not want to fall into this. I wanted to deal with the disgust that concrete arouses, as well as the passion that it inspires. It does both these things. People become exceedingly passionate about it, but at the same time it causes nausea and revulsion. How is one to think about this? How are we to deal with this fact that we have something which is meant so much to architects and engineers, but to many people's perceptions is unpleasant, and they would rather not see too much of it. Concrete has allowed us to do all sorts of things that were beyond the means of people in previous times, but at the same time we are revolted by it. And in a sense, I mean, this is a feature of its modernity. This is like many other products of modernity. It does things that we benefit from, but we're uneasy about it. But the central thing is that I wanted to stress is that disgust seems to be a fundamental feature of this material. We never get away from it quite, however clever some architects and some engineers may be at casting it in an attractive light. Okay. Now the fourth thing that I wanted to deal with is that I didn't want this just to be a book about the works of great architects and engineers. I wanted to be able to think about concrete in whatever form it might appear in. I wanted to be able to take something like this, a piece of concrete that appears, arbitrarily, incomprehensibly in some place, and to feel that I could say something about it, even though this has never been, touched by the hand of an architect. Many of the uses of concrete that we find are independent, innocent of architects. So I didn't really only want to deal with things done by architects. I wanted to be able to say something about any piece of concrete that you might find anywhere in the world. This one's just outside this building. You may recognize it. And to think about it in its own terms. I was just as interested in anonymous concrete objects as in the works of known architects. But in addition to this, I also wanted to think about concrete in other contexts as well. So concrete has meant all sorts of things to people in many occupations. So, for example, it's meant a lot to businessmen. This man here in the white coat is François Ennebig, who is the great Belgian contractor who developed the first large-scale system for producing concrete and licensed it throughout the world. This is the construction of a bridge in Rome, which was his first licensed work in Italy. But the point of this is that concrete has been of great importance to all sorts of occupations outside architecture. One might take businessmen, but one might take politicians. So in the context of the Soviet Union, the production of precast panels, in this case, concrete construction, had, deep political significance. It mattered to politicians. Politicians staked their lives and their careers on concrete. It's been of importance to artists. So this is, a work by the American sculptor Bruce Nauman, cast of the space under my chair. And clearly it's meant something in the context of an artist and sculpture. And there are other examples that I could show you. It's meant something to photographers. So, photographers have been fascinated by photography, by concrete. This is one of Bernd and Hiller Becker's photographs of industrial objects. And, the material of concrete, it has been something which has been of deep fascination to photographers. Go to any, contemporary photography exhibition, and it will have pictures of concrete in it. You can be absolutely sure of this. And the reason is because it's such a wonderful texture for reflecting light and receiving light. It allows the medium of photography to perform so well. So it's been of interest, it's mattered in that context. It's been of value to clergymen, churches. You think of the number of churches which exist thanks to concrete. It's been of importance to writers, filmmakers, and so on. So I was interested in the way in which the material had been taken up and used by all sorts of different practices, not just architects and engineers, to make things out of, but in a slightly different way, obviously, to the way in which architects and engineers have used it. Now, the next concern that I had was that the research that I did should, as far as possible, be based on the evidence of the works themselves. It's been my observation that architectural history as a discipline has not been particularly easy with built works. And this is very odd, that given the choice, most architectural historians now would much rather talk about a photograph or a text or a film or a drawing than they would to talk about a building. The buildings actually embarrass architectural historians. They don't know how to talk about them. Now, there are all sorts of reasons for this, which to some extent I've been complicit in and I perfectly understand. But I wanted to see whether one could develop a project within which the interrogation of the works and the evidence that the works themselves throw up might actually become part of the discussion. I wanted to see if we could possibly change a little this balance within architectural history, more in favour of the work and a little less in favour of its other discourses, the other discourses and forms of mediation in architecture which have really dominated the discipline over the last 20 or 30 years. So part of my interest was really an experiment, we could put it that way, in seeing what happens if the examination of the works themselves takes precedence over other forms of mediation. The next thing that I was concerned with was that many books and studies of concrete end up being a lot of case studies and a lot of, maybe sometimes historical, maybe sometimes current case studies of individual buildings. And I wanted to avoid this. I felt this wasn't terribly satisfactory because basically you end up with a list. And a book which is a list isn't a very interesting book. So I wanted to avoid simply presenting lots of case studies and to find some other way of dealing with the material than through a series of case studies. Now, obviously, the way in which I've gone about this, doing the research, was to look at lots of cases, but I didn't want that to become the defining feature of the result. So a problem for me was how to avoid that effect of it being many case studies. So really just to end this discussion about this project, I very quickly just explain that essentially the form that I took to write about this was by taking a series of oppositions, things about concrete which seemed to me to be a series of polarities. So between it being modern and unmodern, between it being natural and artificial, historical and unhistorical, and so on. Now, the objection to this might be that this is a linguistic model. And I make no apology about this. I mean, this, I'm afraid, is the way in which I think and work. I've found it always easiest to think about things using a linguistic model of understanding things. But essentially, my working process was to organize the themes of the book around cases, incidences of these kinds of polarities between one thing and another. And just in defense of this, let's take one case. This is a building in Crete, and what's fascinating about this is that you have an apparently archaic building here which has sprouted this piece of modern construction above it. And it's the contrast between these two which is intriguing. Moreover, this is a building that's permanently incomplete. It's never going to be finished, because the reason for doing this is in order to secure tax exemption for the building here. An incomplete building in the Greek context attracts no property tax. So this is, it's decorative, if you like, here, but it's also a vital piece of the fiscal apparatus of the building. It's there in order to secure its permanent exemption from taxation. But it's fascinating because in this we have, there is this excessively obvious contrast between, as it were, two histories, two phases of construction. Something which relates apparently to the past, and something which, as it were, dreams towards a future, and a future which is never going to happen. And this, it does, seems to me, suggests that some kind of process of thinking of assimilation which deals through polarities and contrasts might be appropriate to approaching this medium. So this was something I saw very early on when I first started getting interested in concrete, and it fascinated me, this, and I kind of kept it in my mind as I was continuing. So this is of interest, and one might want to think about this in terms of the project as well. This is we could come back to that. Okay, so that's really what I have to say about this particular project that I've worked on. And so this is a project in terms of architectural history rather than of architecture, but I've described to you how I've formulated it and how I developed it. What I'd like to do now, and this will occupy the rest of the time this afternoon, is to look at a particular project and talk about a particular project which I didn't write about in the book, but which I've been looking at recently. And it seems to be of some potential interest in relation to the theme of your discussions. And this is a work called Il Creto in Sicily, at a town called Gibellina, which some people may know. I can see some nodding going on in the audience. So if you're familiar with this, that's good. But if you're not, I'll explain it to you. Right, it exists. It's a large area of hillside in the center of Sicily, in a relatively unpopulated area of Sicily, where the area of the hillside is covered in concrete. And you see it in one view here and in another view here. So it's a large area. There's some wind turbines up in the background, but it spreads over, in fact, about 6.5 hectares of concrete, which is divided up into island blocks. And as you'll see in a moment, these pathways between them are approximately the width of a narrow street. The height of the blocks is roughly constant. It's about 1.6 meters high. And you can walk through this and walk up and down it. Now, what is this? Well, this was made in the late 1980s on the site of a town which was destroyed in, hang on, I'll skip these. Let's go. I'll come back to this in a moment and talk about this. This is the town of Gibellina was destroyed in an earthquake very suddenly in 1968. There was a big earthquake in central Sicily which destroyed half a dozen towns, and a lot of people lost their homes. That's before the earthquake, Gibellina. That's after the earthquake, and you can see there's not much left standing. It's a catastrophic earthquake. For the people were moved out and housed in temporary huts and tents and so on, where they stayed for a long time. The authorities were extremely slow about rebuilding the town or relocating the occupants. It became a national scandal in Italy. A sign of the kind of ineffectiveness of the Italian government. The cause of the inhabitants was taken up by some local politicians, and they campaigned to move the site of the town to another location about 20 kilometers away. And this has been quite common in Sicily, that when there have been earthquakes, towns are often rebuilt on sites some distance from the original place. So there are precedents for this. But in this case, the new site was considerably, quite a long way away, because it was thought that the new site would offer better opportunities for employment and so on. So the town was moved to a new town, and a new town was built some way away. A new mayor was elected, who was a man called Ludovico Corral, he'd been a communist representative for that region of Sicily, but really took up the cause of the citizens of Gibellina and helped promote this new town. Now, the new town is a very curious place, if anyone's been there. It's very low density compared to the very high density of the old town. And it's full of the most extraordinary works of postmodern architecture. It has an appearance, because of its low density, of being a sort of ghost town. There are a number of unfinished buildings, like this curious multi-story car park at the end here. Why a town of this density needs a multi-story car park beats me. There are some very odd bits of postmodernism, like this building over here, and a large number of curious empty spaces of this kind. pieces of postmodernism, like this building here, and a great deal of public art, like this stuff here. Now, I won't for the moment say anything more about this, but the town was effectively curated by Corral, by the man who became the mayor, who promoted the involvement of a large number of artists and architects, and particularly a number of avant-garde, what were then avant-garde Roman architects, became involved in this city, quite curiously. Now, in his desire to attract artists to the city, he approached some quite well-known figures, among them Joseph Beuys, whom he tried to persuade to come and do something there, and then Alberto Burri. Now, Alberto Burri was quite a big figure in Italian art in the post-war period, and is most famous for what he called his celotex paintings, which were canvases which he burnt, often with sheets of plastic, which he burnt with a flame gun. So he produced these canvases, if you can call them that, of partially destroyed works, and these were all done on a, they're all flat things. I mean, all Burri's work had been in terms of flat art. Corral persuaded Burri to come to Ghibellina and got him to come, hoping that Burri would feel inspired to do something when he got there. Burri saw this town and said, I can't do anything here, it's full of art already. He wasn't inspired in the least. But he said, let me go and see, can I go and see the old town? And so he went out, was taken out one evening to see the old town, the ruins. And it was just getting dark when he saw it. And he was incredibly moved by this. And he went back. He came from the north of Italy. And he went back. And 3 days later, he phoned his architect friend, collaborator, said, I've got an idea. And his idea was that he would produce what he called a creto. Now, some of his paintings had been surfaces which were covered with cracks. Essentially, Burri was interested in entropy, in the decay, of artificial decay applied to pictorial surfaces. And he thought he could do something like this on the hillside. So he came up. This is Burri with Corral, who's the politician, visiting. This is the creto while it's being built. This was his first model. He did a model like this, where he showed what he thought he would do, that he would cover the town with essentially a sheet of concrete like this, marking out where the previous street pattern had been. The remains would be flattened and moved into the island lots, and the whole thing would become a single sheet of concrete. So that's his idea, and this is a close-up of the model that he made, where you can see a cut-out figure to give a sense of the dimensions. Now, this model is quite important because Burri was very concerned that the qualities of the model, which are this extreme roughness, and the paths have been effectively made by scraping out the clay or the plaster or whatever it was, and in order to just leave gaps between them. He was very concerned that the actual qualities that were in the original model should be reproduced in the finished thing. And this becomes something of some interest later. So the intention was, this is a sketch that was done by the architect with whom he collaborated on this, to explain the process. So the remains of the town were bulldozed into piles, which were then walled in with concrete and covered over in this way. So this explains, what's happening. Okay, so that's the plan. Now, this solution was one which actually rather suited the comune of Gibellina, because what had been happening was that they'd moved the town to this new location, but the residents of Gibellina often went back there to visit where they used to live. They liked to go back and see their old homes, at weekends and, so on, public holidays. They'd make a revisit to their original homes, and which is kind of understandable. But the difficulty was that the ruins were becoming increasingly dangerous, that they were becoming unstable. The place was inhabited by wild dogs. It wasn't a place that it was really safe to walk about in. And the comune were rather concerned about this and were thinking, well, they were going to have to fence off the whole place or do something with it to make it safe. So actually this solution, this idea of Buri's, of enshrouding the whole thing in concrete, served their purposes rather well. Buri's idea was that once he'd done this, the layout of the streets would be recognizable to the inhabitants, that they would be able to see where they used to live, but know that it was buried in concrete. They would be able to, recognize the street plan of the town that they'd lived in. They'd be able to go back there, and that they would be able to, on feast days and public holidays and so on, religious festivals, they'd still be able to perform, some kind of ritual commemorations and so on. Which was his plan, and indeed that's exactly what happened, that when the thing was completed, people did go there, and it was used as effectively a site of commemoration of the city that they'd lost. Anyway, to go back to the realization of it, this is as it looked now. This is as you see it now, over on the hillside, with these irregular shaped lots. It's not exactly actually the street pattern that you see here, but some of the streets follow the original line. I think this one follows the line of one of the streets. That's as you see it here. It's seen from the air. And this is a diagram of it in the early stages. Now, what you'll realize is that it's not actually quite as big as the original thing, and it's not finished. The original town occupied 12 hectares, and in fact, the Creti, as it is now, only occupies 6.5 hectares. So it's not true to the original site. And this shows the thing in the course of construction as they were doing it. It was built, over about 4 or 5 years until 91, and effectively they ran out of money at that point. So it stopped at 6.5 hectares. So in a sense, it's unfinished. It's never been finished, and this has been an issue as to whether it should be finished or whether it should just be left alone. There you see it under snow. There you see it under sunlight. There you see figures. So you can get a sense of the height of this. The concern here was that one should not feel claustrophobic in this. The walls are just high enough just low enough for a person to see over the top of them. You're not completely enclosed within them. It's looking down. And you'll see that in this and other pictures, the attempt to preserve the kind of crudeness of the model, the irregularity of these walls, the unevenness of the surface at the top, was all an attempt to scale up that roughness of the original model. There you see some figures, and you can see, the relative height of the thing. You can just see over the top. They vary slightly in height. They're not all quite the same height. Here you see an attempt. They were quite ingenious in developing ways of moulding providing formwork for the concrete so as to give this kind of textured finish to it, as if in the model. It was important that it should not be too regular. Burri apparently complained that he thought it was too smooth. He didn't like it. Burri apparently complained about everything. He wasn't satisfied with anything with this, and said that it was much too smooth. It should be rougher. But this was their solution to it. And there is the finished thing again. Just a word about the execution of it. Burri has the idea. He effectively then hands it over to his architect collaborator to work out how to do it. The architect works with an engineer, a local engineer, and it's the engineer who's really responsible for the execution. The work was done by different contractors. It was done in about 6 or 7 different phases. They could only work on one section at a time when they got the money to do it. Corral had to be very clever to get the money in order to do this, and effectively took money from other grants and other projects that he'd received money for in relation to the city. He had to divert funds that had been intended for other purposes in order to do this. There was no actual money ever allocated to this as such. So it was a kind of quite a clever operation on Corral's behalf to make this possible. So that's the story. Now, in terms of the project, there are some things about this that I think are interesting and which one might want to reflect on. The first of these is, what is it? Is it a work of art? Is it a work of land art? Is it a memorial? Is it a work of architecture? It's not clear what it is. It's not easy to classify it within any of these terms. It's all of these or none of them. And that, I think, is part of its interest, is that its genre is uncertain. And that immediately, I think, creates some interest in the discussion about it as a project, is of what category is it? Yes, it's a memorial, one can say, and in terms of it being a memorial, it's quite a successful one. Maybe I'll come back to that in a moment. But anyway, so that's the first question is, well, what is it? What sort of a thing is it? The second feature of it as a project, which I think is intriguing, is the fact that it is unfinished. It's not complete in the terms in which the artist, anyway, had conceived it. And yet, you know, it's there. It's, in a sense, it is complete. It's as complete as it's ever going to be. But if we go back to this question about the project as being something that belongs in the future, that's projected in the future, or refers to an existing reality, which of those applies to this? Do we talk about this as the thing, in terms of the thing as it might be if it had been finished, or do we talk about it in terms of what is there at the present? I don't know. There is a question in this, what I've referred to, of the scaling up of something from the model to the built reality. One of the things that these notes that Tim's prepared about the project refers to is the fact that the project always involves translations from one discourse to another, I can't remember exactly how you put it, but in terms of a collision between different discourses. The project involves some kind of exchange or transfer or conjunction between different discourses. And that's clearly present here. We have a discourse of an artist, which then has to be translated into the discourse of an engineer and a contractor, who are able to realize something which approximates to what has been conceived of by the initiator of it, who wasn't necessarily thinking about this problem at all. So that difficulty about the various discourses that are involved in this, I think, is important. And then there's a whole question about its decay. As you see it now, it's been cleaned up and restored to a certain degree. But over the last 20-odd years, since work stopped on it, it had acquired a certain amount of, vegetation. Parts of it had started to crack and decay. Shrubs were sprouting out of it. Grass was growing on it. And 5 or 6 years ago, it looked very different because nature was taking it back, as it were. And at the time, the solution was, well, they decided that they'd go and kill everything and spray it with weed killer and prevent further growth and repair the bits that had cracked and so on, and try and return it to its original, something like its original or earlier state. But this, I think, is an interesting question, because in a way you could say, well, actually, this is a case where nature should be allowed to take its course. We have something which has been produced in order to cover this surface, lay a shroud over it, but maybe it's reasonable to say, well, let's leave it and see what happens. Which in a way, you could say is kind of consistent with Buri's own art and interest in decay and entropy and so on. So there's a question about, do you restore it? Do you take it back to something like its original condition? Do you wash it with bleach and, get it back to the original whiteness of it? Or do you just accept the inevitable decay? In fact, the solution that they've adopted is that they do go and spray it every year with weed killer now, so nothing grows there. It stays like that. And then finally, I think interesting in it as a project is the fact that it functions as a memorial. It serves as a memorial for the citizens of the town, of whom there are now fewer and fewer who remember the old place. But it is still a site of pilgrimage for people who live in the new town. It it has preserved, in a way, the memory of the town where they used to live. I mean, the alternative would have just have been to leave the ruins there and let them decay and nature to take over and things to grow up around it, in which case it would have been lost. This actually effectively it creates this a new sort of dead city. And there have been lots of correspondences made to Pompeii and Herculaneum and so on, and also to ruined sites in Sicily, sites of previous earthquakes, you know, Selinunte, where you have these ruined Greek temples and so on. So it has some resonances with other lost towns, as it were. So it has some interest, I think, as in its, I think, reasonably successful functioning as a memorial. So these seem to be some of the questions that, or issues that it provokes in terms of what is a project, particularly in relation to past and future, or future and present. Okay, I think I'll stop at that point, and let's see what happens now. Okay.